So Danah, your new book, it's complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens. It's a very provocative and compelling title. What were some of the discoveries that you made in the researching and preparation of this book that surprised you?
So I started the book as an academic and as a researcher. I started the project as an academic and as a researcher. But I was also personally, one of the first generation of young people who grew up online. And so part of it is I came to this project trying to understand how technology had changed from when I was growing up. And I, perhaps naively, had hoped and dreamed that it would be this huge transformative thing like it was for me. And so I went into this project trying to untangle what was it like when it became mainstream. And I had to contend with the fact that most young people were not using it in the ways I might hope and dream and imagine it to be used, and that it had just gotten integrated into everyday life. Meanwhile, the fears and anxieties that adults had about kids, which had plagued my teenage years, had shifted from just being about the public environment, the mall, the park, to everything being online. And the parallels were really striking, right? Which is just like, oh my gosh, stranger danger, oh my gosh, meanness and cruelty, all of this. And so, when I originally embarked on the project, it was to think about it from a scholarly perspective. And along the way, I realized that it was really important to start having a conversation with a broader, more public audience, right? With educators, with parents, with, all the people who had an interest in young people. And so the book is a really funny one because it's not just about what surprised me, it's about what in some ways became so common to an external audience was different from what I was seeing on the ground. I was trying to do these bridging functions, trying to help people see what I was seeing. And along the way I learned to appreciate young people from their perspective, and it became really obvious to me. So much so that I thought the original title was going to be like duh, because teenagers, when I would turn my data over them, they'd be like, duh, like why is this remotely interesting, right? And I was like, man, I can't come up with anything interesting. Clearly, because all the teenagers are telling me I'm lame. And of course, the adults are just like, what is this? And so, this is where, part of it is all of those different levels of what was shocking, which was confusing, was all about the moment of being a translator between different worlds.
And so what do you think, growing up as somebody, as you said, who, sort of grew up in an online world, what do you think the main differences are between the way you are oriented toward that life and kids that you interviewed and talked with that are in school now? Right.
So for my cohort getting online, we were the classic early adopters, which meant that we were self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers. And I was all three, so the internet was fabulous. We went online in spite of what was normative amongst our peers. In fact, often in resistance to it. Our parents generally thought that any form of technology had to be educational. And so whatever we were doing, even when it was 2 a.m., was clearly learning somehow, until the phone bills came in, and then that was a whole separate issue. But we got away with a lot. And there was a lot of experimentation that I was allowed to do, in part because nobody thought to ask. And that was unbelievably transformative for me. So an example is that I still remember these really late night conversations, probably around my junior year of high school, with a transgender woman who was twice my age, explaining to me gender and sexuality, allowing me to ask some of the most naive and inappropriate questions, but giving me a perspective that there was no way I was going to get in my small town. Allowing me to challenge and engage in this conversation that to an outsider would have been deemed as devious, if not sexual, and terrible in all these ways. How could an older, transgender woman possibly interact with a young high school student in any way productive? And so, these were the kinds of contours that were so core to what it was like to be a teen in those days, was having these intense conversations, learning about a world that was much bigger than mine, no stranger danger conversation about the internet, that was all about the offline world, and being amongst people who thought about the world that I did and wanted to escape. None of us really wanted to interact with our peers, which was part of why we were online. A decade later, what I saw, aside from obviously the technologies having improved and all of that, was that young people were going online first and foremost to interact with their friends. The people they already knew from school, after school, church, summer camp, that kind of thing. And so what I saw online was very much indicative of the norms of the offline world, as opposed to a culture that had formed around resistance to that offline world. Meanwhile, of course, the stranger danger conversation was so striking, such that I would, talk to queer youth, and they would just be like, "Oh, I can't talk to strangers online." And I was like, "Okay, you've heard this message, so where are you getting support?" And I was like, "Support? What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Oh, that is heartbreaking," because for so many queer youth that I grew up with, it was the saving grace. It was the thing that allowed you to know that you weren't alone. So it was a lot of that. It was like, what does it mean when it becomes mainstream? And I think that for a lot of my cohort, there was a lot of existential sadness about the mainstreamness, because I think that people who were really involved in the internet in the 90s really hoped that it would be this moment of enlightenment for the public writ large. And that if everybody just got access, they would wake up, that our battles over, inequity would disappear, that, we would learn to appreciate people from around the globe. This would be fantastic, and that's not what happened.
Well, that's, if you think about schools and how schools, so there's how parents approach parenting kids online and what the role of technology is in the home, and then there's also a transformation in the role of technology in school. What do you think is the position, schools, what position should schools take relative to technology and social networking?
So there's many layers to that question that are really complicated, and I want to separate out young people's engagement with social technologies because they're doing so in their peer-oriented world with the things that I would argue are more educational technologies, ed tech kinds of conversations. In that first camp of sociality, historically educators have been a part of young people's networks and lives, not just in the role as an educator or a teacher, but as a part of the community. And one of the things that we've lost in light of the stranger danger conversation, in light of the hysteria around educators, is a realization and a respect for teachers to be a part of the community. And we've told young people they can't possibly interact with any adult in a healthy manner outside of a prescribed definition. That to me is very sad, because in the early days of social media, again, before people were panicked about it, I saw a ton of educators who would jump on whatever the popular sites were, that time MySpace and the like, and they would be present in kids' lives, and kids would engage with them and be like, "Yo, Mr. C, what's up?" Right? And there would be this interesting dialogue that was really important. And then over time, principals got involved, administrations got involved, and said, no, you cannot interact with these students outside of these environments. And for me, this is actually very heartbreaking, because for a lot of young people, sure, parents are there, they're engaged, they have these adults that, are really supportive in their lives. But there are a lot of young people where that's not true, where they're looking for people they trust, people that they respect, and that often means educators. And so there's a sadness to me within the school ecosystem, how much we have tried to create these boundaries in a world that is extraordinarily networked for young people who want to be a part of that network world, and the educational system is now carving out lines and making schools separable from community. The second component of it has to do with education technologies and the role of technology in pedagogical activities. And that has had these different realities. Some are shaped by vendors, by the creation of those technology enterprises who are seeking to make money off of schools, that are pushing the adoption of technology because it's cool or because it's, it's the hot thing, it'll give you different analytics, there's a whole variety of different things. And I definitely furrow my brow and ask questions in that space, because I'm not convinced that anything that is driven by an economic interest is necessarily going to be the right venue, because even if the technology is really smart and sophisticated, if it's not adopted in a way that makes pedagogical sense, it doesn't work out well. The second is a whole slew of innovative educators and administrations who are sitting there trying to get creative about how you can leverage all of the various tools that are out there. Some that are from the sort of ed tech vendor corporate environment, some that are from they're just part of the public ecosystem. Say, how do you incorporate this into our larger mission of educating and informing, this generation of young people? And that experimentation is pretty phenomenal to watch. But it's also clear how little we actually know, right? What works, what doesn't. It's all a big old experiment. And some people are in better shape at experimenting than others. But it also creates these new challenges of inequity, because it relies on teachers or schools to be willing to be those creative forces and to think outside the box, often in resistance to the systems around them, whether those systems are the community, the government, you know, the institutional structures, again, depending on the public-private dynamic of this. And, you know, figure out what makes sense. But for a lot of young people who are not in schools that are willing to be risk-taking, or you know, educators who are willing to think outside the box, to get trained on how to use technology, to, you know, imagine different ways, they're not experiencing the different possibilities of this. And so we're having this odd moment where we're seeing experiences really diverge, depending classroom by classroom, not even school by school, in terms of what young people are being exposed to. And so I think the challenge for a lot of educators is to step back and say, okay, what can we do? How do we understand that? What are the different mechanisms by which it is possible? How do we make certain it's pedagogically driven as opposed to driven by other interests? And how do we make certain that the experiences are more generally widespread rather than just experienced by a certain segment of the population who by and large tends to be the more privileged part of the population?
Outstanding. One of the things I'm thinking about as you're talking about your own experience and about, you know, the experience of kids that you were, you know, interviewing and processing the data from to write your book is how the experience of kids in different groups based on their own identity and based on their own circumstance may be very different. And I'm wondering if that's a theme that emerged in the research you did too, like how does gender, how does race, how does class, sexuality, how does that affect someone's experience relative to social networking?
Right. You know, it's even more complicated than talking about it in terms of classes, as in protected classes, as in these classic categories. What your experience on social media is shaped by is the people within your network. Now, that network is inevitably shaped by all of these different forces and factors. But it also creates a complicated element of it, such that even early on, I was thinking about those early days of MySpace, before it had any media coverage, before anybody knew what it was. The first group of youth that I sat down with, that I was really engaging in trying to tell me what was awesome about MySpace, they believed it to be a Christian site. Everybody who they saw had made hero as Jesus and had used the opportunity, which was a section for quotes at the time, had used that to make biblical references. And they were dumbfounded that somebody might use MySpace in a way that wasn't religiously oriented, because clearly it was designed to be religiously oriented. And it was this moment of watching the site, which I knew was playing out in different ways in different communities, be shaped by a group within their network, right? Very clearly so. And we see that, you know, overwhelmingly across all of these sites. So, you know, I always love talking to adults about Twitter, right? Because Twitter is at least something that people understand what that is. And they think that it is generally a place to share URLs, right? To share interesting information and links that everybody should click through. And they're shocked when I point out that most teenagers never see a URL in their Twitter stream. Like, that's just not how they see it at all. And so, you know, these moments of these same technologies that will be used by two different audiences in radically different ways. And a lot of it has to do, we can talk about it course categories, but it's literally about who you're following. So you normalize your practices based on all of the people that you're seeing. The people you're following, the people you're friends with, depending on the particular system. And those network effects and those norms get shaped across all of this. And so I think it's pretty amazing to watch that play out. And there are huge variations. And I think that that's where I start to struggle with it, because when you see you know, phenomenal opportunities or see different things flow through, they flow through depending on who you're connected to. And if you're not already connected to the points of privilege, you don't even see the information that we assume to be flowing through, because it's very much shaped by those networks. And we've always known this in a word-of-mouth sense. But what does it mean where we theoretically could connect to people around the globe, and in reality we're connected to people who have a very narrow perspective on the world? And sometimes that narrow perspective is valuable, and sometimes it is very, very myopic. And how do you learn to see outside of that?
Well, if you were to think about how, what what message do you think school leaders and boards of trustees at independent schools should most hear about the role of technology in the life of young kids?
I think that what educators need to realize is that young people need to be a part of public life. You can't restrict them to say, oh, here we're going to bound them, we're going to control them, we're going to educate them divorced from this broader ecosystem. And that means that regardless of what they're doing in the classroom, outside of the classroom, they are learning over a period of time to participate in public life, and first and foremost these days through social media. Right? So sure, a 6-year-old is not that engaged with public life, but by the time they're 16 and they're really full on Instagram, it's a totally different game. As educators and as an education system, we have a responsibility to young people to help them learn how to navigate the publics that they have access to in a responsible manner, how to ask the hard questions, how to be critical thinkers of it. And in order to do that, we can't divorce ourselves from these public environments. We can't create a very specific, bounded, safe world of technology. We need to figure out how to integrate these technologies that they are participating in into an environment where we can help young people ask the critical questions. This doesn't mean become their best friend on Instagram, right? They don't want you in their business in that way. But helping them learn to have the kinds of media literacy, the kinds of critical computational literacy becomes really important to this environment. And so that's where, for me, technology is a tool. It has a very important role in different kinds of pedagogical efforts. It's really important that that's recognized, but it's also really important that young people's engagement with technology beyond the classroom, beyond learning in a formalist sense, is also recognized and legitimized within an education sphere, so that we find ways of connecting those different points of learning and realizing that there's a lot of learning about the world that occurs when people are just hanging out. And I think that the weird part is technology has created these networks across experiences, across people, and all these other things, at the same time that educational institutions have worked on boundary setting in the most formalistic sense. And that, to me, is what I would say that anybody involved in an administration of an educational apparatus needs to work to resist, is this desire to boundary make in order to provide a concretized understanding of learning and say, no, we need that learning to be connected to the young person as a whole.
Well, Danah, thank you so much for your time. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay.